All right, hello and welcome to Jesus is the Answer, Part 21. The Scriptures shall not be broken. All right, going through this, and I kind of stated, at the very beginning, this is, really kind of like a paleo project. And what I mean is that it's kind of an ancient idea that will hopefully one day formulate to where I can get this into better production. But I'm really kind of going over issues of Christ and Jesus and really focusing on skepticism and things of that nature. So now we're going to tackle inerrancy. We did a little bit of things with historicity, and obviously this subject is going to focus on the Gospels. But I want to make some points, and it's hard because what is an error? Some people would say something is an error because they don't like it. Some people may think something is an error because actually they have errors. But you can like look through all the books of the Bible and find something that you reject for whatever reason, and then make something like, hey, yeah, and I got buddy down the street to agree with me, and therefore the Bible has errors, or this error, tons of errors. You don't really see very many things brought up to where, okay, that's definitely a contradiction, and you can say it's a contradiction in the 20th century, and you can say it's a contradiction in the 21st century, because this is a contradictory. Because they don't really have a standard. And typically, the goals are really just to knock down biblical authority. So, there have been a huge amount of claims of the Bible having an error here, an error there, an error there, an error there. Peter Ruckman once made a statement of all the different commentaries and encyclopedias that he used, and he had found that every verse of the Holy Bible, with the exception of maybe 100 verses, and this is probably a statement in the 1980s, but that there was a academic doubt cast upon every single verse of the Bible, with the exception of about 100 verses. Now, Mein Kampf, Hitler's book. Now, some people they do argue that it might not be his actual writing. Maybe there's a ghostwriter in his name, but besides that, there's very, very little criticism of Mein Kampf in that way. Obviously, Hitler was defamed and this stuff is supposed to be wrong, but people are not really putting that kind of time in to hate on Mein Kampf. I mean, it kind of goes without saying, okay, but there's just a rigorous effort to really destroy biblical authority. It is an agenda. They don't want the Bible running society. And instead of, making your own country or openly fighting with Americans, they prefer subterfuge and then to come in and do that. So I'm going to deal with a couple issues here. The first thing is, if we say, let's say the Gospels are inerrant, what does that look like? What does, how do you know that something is an error? Typically, you know that something is an error because you have a higher standard. And because you have a higher standard, then therefore, okay, well, that doesn't really work, because we have a higher standard that shows that, you have errors here because you didn't meet the higher standard. Well, the Bible standard is that it was inspired word for word from Jehovah, whose understanding is infinite. Psalm 147, verse 5. So if God is all knowing, and that is part of his definition, then he's objective. And let God be true and every man a liar. Jehovah is honest. So if he's honest and he's objective and this is his word, that's it. That's the highest standard that you could have. Meanwhile, objectivity is not found in the sciences and other various forms of academia. Some people might say, well, science is absolute. But science is not absolute. It doesn't even actually determine the truth as much as it debunks theories, and then whatever's not debunked is then assumed. So you use the scientific method, you start off with a hypothesis, which is an educated guess. And then you run the hypothesis through experimentation. And once you've run it through this cycle over and over again, then eventually you get to point to where essentially you've kind of declared faith. Said, okay, the law of gravity, scientific law. Could it be debunked one day? Sure. In some ways, it has been. You got rocket ships out in space, float around. There are objects that float in the sea and issues of buoyancy. Things that fly and glide, hot air balloons. But they rework the theory to where it allows for all those things, and they say, okay, well, we got this. But one day it could be observed that gravity stops working. So then what do? You know everything that you can know right now if you could know all science. I don't know if you can know all science. But there would still be potential to kind of say, but we might see it one day. We might see something go crazy. So it is not absolutely objective. And, everything that is measured is not absolutely objectively measured. Such as, one good thought experiment is if you had a ruler and you got this a steel ruler coming straight out of a factory, laser cut, and you took all these 1-foot rulers and you had a superhuman amount of rulers to stack together to make the perfect measurement. And then you took that from the Earth and went all the way to Uranus. And then you did another one the same way. By the time you got to Uranus, those two lines would be miles apart because there are microscopic differences. And when you add the microscopic differences over the light years of space, light, what was it? Light travels about 180 million miles per second, assuming that we're not taking off time for reflection. Or assuming that something to do with reflection. Basically, when you get those gigantic distances, then these microscopic differences become major differences. So that's kind of the way of all things when you're trying to use strict physical science. History can give you tons and tons and tons of facts. Oh, by the way, science also fails because when we look at history, we haven't had experimentation that long. And we have not covered the ancient past with scientific investigation. We can speculate now and then predict it backwards, but that doesn't honestly work. Okay? That's a fallacy, what we call the inductive fallacy, or the fallacy of inductive logic. Then with history, we can get a good grasp of major agreement in history. But when we start breaking down history into smaller categories, we can get wild interpretations to where we can't really state much of anything objective. Anybody can string a couple facts here and there and then make something sound good. You have to have something objective in place. Um, and, mathematics. Mathematics is logical, but you don't actually have a direct connection to reality. You can observe reality and then start, you know, um, estimating things with mathematics upon your observation. But that doesn't mean that you've become objective with your math. Math, numbers are not real. They're mental. They're not real things. But if numbers are not real, then what about imaginary numbers? Okay. there's there's a ton of different things where mathematical logic disconnects from reality. And so if everything is multitudes of all these indecisions and indecisiveness, you cannot come up with objective knowledge. And don't get me started on supernatural esoterics. Okay. Now, when we're dealing with the critical process, they want it to be a science. It's admittedly not even a hard science, it's a soft science. But with these criticisms, typically they impose a naturalistic worldview. And so the naturalistic worldview is presupposed. And if you already believe that there is nothing supernatural, well, then how can somebody prove you different through believing that things are, naturalistic and not supernatural to begin with? Um, it's kind of like a no true Scotsman fallacy. But nevertheless, so there's no standard to wage against inerrancy. I will say that there is some stuff that has to be defended and proven, but you're always going to break it down at some point to what is encouraging faith. Specifically here, faith in the Bible. Now, the Gospels. There's a couple different popular attacks, and so I want to address the popular attacks. There's 4 Gospels, and when there are differences in those Gospels, people claim, well, those differences must be contradictions. And since they must be contradictions, then therefore they must be not inspired and, not true. However, when you deal with history and law and order, what you find is that different witnesses always have different accounts because they have different vantage points. So the fact that one guy mentions one sequence and one guy mentions another does not mean that by nature they contradict. They're simply looking and observing from different vantage points. When it comes to the Old Testament, the Gospels quote the Old Testament a lot. However, the Gospels do not always quote like the Hebrew Masoretic text. You say, oh yeah, it must be the Septuagint. Oh. Sometimes it doesn't quote the Septuagint even if it's in Greek. Well, you do. Well, what is the purpose of the quotations? So in hermeneutics, and hermeneutics is the study of biblical interpretation. In hermeneutics, you have these concepts. One is finding the meaning of the text. What did the text mean? What did the Old Testament mean with this phrase? And then you have the implications. When somebody tells you something, it is not always a peer reviewed research paper. Sometimes there's different genres of communication. And when they do that, sometimes they're only looking for implications. So an implication is something that's in harmony with it. The Old Testament and the Ten Commandments says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." Jesus says, if you have looked at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery with her in your heart. Well, does that mean, therefore, that when the Old Testament talks about a death sentence for adultery, then logically it follows that there's a death sentence for perverted thinking? No. Why? Because Jesus was not trying to give you the meaning of that text. You can get the meaning of the text from the Old Testament, both in its two versions or two accounts of Deuteronomy and Exodus, other quotations from the rest of the Tanakh or the New Testament, and also, um, some passages within that very book that will give you context. So, finding the context is not necessary for a Old Testament quotation. Old Testament quotation, most of the time that I find, are implications. So, just like you commit adultery physically, you can commit adultery simply in your heart. And so, there might be some spiritual implications. You've committed a sin, but it's not the physical act and the physical law. So implications are often what those quotes are, not always rarely exposition, I should say. 3, figures of speech. And let me see here. I wrote a note. Let's see here, confusion. And I talk about various figures of speech. You got hyperbole. That's when you want dramatic effect for your statement. You're saying this is true, but you're adding a lot of exaggeration to get the point home across. Okay. I was commenting on a boxing Facebook page, and they were knocking Rocky Marciano because he beat Joe Louis, but Joe Louis was getting old. Well, Joe Louis was old, as in Joe Louis was 37 years old, and Marciano was 27. But they said that Joe Louis was 75. He would have been 55 or something close to that when he won his first world title. That's an exaggeration. That's hyperbole. Idioms. People talk about this a lot. I know it's way old. People wouldn't understand it now, but Michael Jackson came out with a hit song called Bad. I'm bad. I'm bad. I'm really, really bad. Well, bad was not him saying that, like, I'm bad at basketball. I'm bad at singing. My music is bad. It's terrible. It's not what he's doing. It's an idiom. And the idiom meant tough. Okay. So he was telling people he's tough. Who's bad? Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was scary. But basically, you have people saying idioms. It's raining cats and dogs. Then you have parables. Parables are stories, but the stories are meant to tell a specific, um, specific wisdom truth. Okay, so you're trying to learn a wise lesson, and it's not meant to be um, fiction in the sense that they're not telling you that this is true. They're telling you something very vague. There once was a this, and there once was a that. And did you hear the one about the priest, the rabbi, and the minister? Okay, well those are little stories. That's a joke too, but they're itty bitty stories. But they're not meant, and they're said in a way to where you know that they're not historical accounts. So lots of different figures of speech, and I'm not exhausting the topic. I'm just kind of giving some things out there. Also, there are generalized numbers. Sometimes we give an estimate of numbers, and that's common what we do in our speech. There was a parable of Jesus feeding the 5,000. We think he probably fed more than 5,000 because it was only regarding the men. And you have to assume that the kids and the wife would have come too, especially for healing and entertainment, wisdom. So, basically, it's a safe estimation to say, okay, it's about 5,000 men. Could have been 4,999 or 5,001, but we keep it at that level. Then we have, other mistakes that are not necessary to be errors. Okay. The some common mistakes that people can make are translations. They didn't translate it literally to what the original Greek and Hebrew or whatever said. Or maybe they translate it in a way that's technically right, but you might not know that that word translated has a couple meanings. And that meaning might be what they call archaic. It might have been something that you don't use in your culture. And so you don't know what they're using that word for. So you got to find the context. Manuscript differences. Um, a lot of people have trouble believing in the Bible because there are manuscript differences. And I believe in the inerrancy of a specific manuscript, the Textus Receptus and the Hebrew Masoretic text. So it sounds like I have to defend more, but in some ways I defend less because I believe that there are errors with other manuscripts. And translations from those manuscripts obviously tend to have some errors somewhere. So I don't have to defend those things. I can say, you know what, they've got these new translations, and they still might be useful for Bible study. They still might be useful for, because they put something in a different way that you weren't thinking of. They might be valuable for evangelism or some sort of devotional purpose. Okay. But they're not authoritative because they do have errors, because they start off with the wrong manuscripts and maybe the wrong translation philosophy. Now, here's some positive things to move us in that direction. The Bible is historically true, and we need to err on the side of truth instead of, lies, horrible, unhistorical, mythology, all that kind of stuff. And so, some things that we might look at is the names. Like, what are you talking about the names? Well, some of these names that are used can really tell you about the culture at that time. It's hard in the New Testament because most of your literature around the Jewish people at that time would have been placed in Jerusalem's temple. And the temple got destroyed and burnt up. And so those documents got destroyed and burnt up. Luckily, we found other things. Josephus's manuscripts. Josephus wrote in Rome in Latin, but he was a Jew, probably a rabbi himself. And so he had huge amounts of history that were not burned. Okay. And then you have other outsiders who did similar things. So, when you look at the New Testament, though, the names will give us some records. They might use Hebrew names with Greekisms. That means that they were speaking Greek, and so they would use a Hebrew name and speak it in a Greek way. So the Greek name of Jesus is Isu. Now, some people will call him Yeshua because they're assuming Hebrew. Maybe he was called Yeshua and Isu, but if you read the Greek New Testament, it's Isu. Okay? If you read it in English, it's Jesus. Was there a conspiracy to make a J? No. Different languages use letters differently. So Germans will look at the J and they use a J with a strong J. Okay? And the German language influenced the English language. So we say that with a J. In Spanish, there's a H. And I think in Latin, it's more like a I. So, you'll have these different pronunciations because of different letters. And people will tend to see the letters and read those into them. In America, back in the day, maybe a century ago, people used the T's the Chinese because when they use an L, they'll say an R. And that's the difference between the different letters that are picked and used in common speech. So they would really like, they would really like, but, and sometimes you try to be a little bit more accurate, but that's just something that happens. So when you see these names, you'll see the nicknames, for instance. And they might not use a full name. I typically, close friends can call me Matthew. I don't stop you if you want to call me Matthew, but typically it's my close friends who call me Matthew. And then when, people I hang out with call me Matt. And so these will show what the generation was like in the first century Judaism. And it all matches up quite well. As we said, our archaeology, we start to find different places and it'll show us, for instance, the topography, which is, there are some mountains and sometimes you would travel geographically south, but you would be going up because the mountain levels, you're going up the mountain. So say they said, "Oh, we went up to Jerusalem," and most time we'd say, "Well, we went south to Jerusalem. We went down to Jerusalem," but they're going up a mountain. Okay. Undesigned coincidences. This is something Lydia and Tim McGrew are kind of famous for. I'm just starting to get the handle on it. But the idea would be, for instance, that in one gospel, you have mention of some information, and you wonder, well, how they get that information. But in another gospel, they'll mention how they got the information. So we know, like in Luke, there was some people in the royal family, and we can tell when it talks about they thought about this and they thought that, and they asked them this in private conversations. Well, somebody in the royal family must have witnessed this. And then somebody sees, okay, Jesus at the temple, and this is said, and that's mentioned in a different gospel. What a coincidence. It's an undesigned coincidence because they're not trying to. They just happen to be observing the same facts. Unnecessary details. When Mary and Joseph took their child, Jesus, well, some people say, well, it was Joseph's adopted child. But when they took the baby Jesus to get circumcised, they came across a prophet or two. I know Anna the prophetess, and there's another one, but I'm thinking extemporaneously, so forgive me. But when they did that, there was a prophecy made, and it says that Joseph and Joseph's mother were marveling at this prophet. Well, I don't remember anything talking about Joseph's mother. Why, if you're making this up, would you want to bring her up? I mean, we don't have enough to say that she was alive outside of that. So, why would you bring up that Joseph's mother was there if Joseph's mother was not there? That's that's an unnecessary detail, and that's what people do when they give an eyewitness account. Let's see here, embarrassment. When the apostles look bad, why are they going to embarrass themselves in their own account? Unless it was true and people at the time could call them out on it. Many times, Peter embarrassed himself. And then there's also micro confessions. This gets called different things. It'd be called confessions or little creeds. But essentially, there are belief statements, especially in the letters of Paul, that show that he got that somewhere. It was probably a saying among the people that he went to church with. And this is used more by Gary Habermas because they go under that idea that the Gospels were written, 40, 50, 60 years from the time. But as I've stated, I think that's bunk. I don't see the point of that. That's a retracted view where the critics were starting off saying that it was made. I remember one source said that they thought it was like 1000 AD when they wrote that stuff. Typically, they thought it was 300 years and they developed all this mythology. However, they had to walk it back and walk it back and walk it back till it's 70, 80 AD. And um, really, that was not being charitable. But you find these other statements that show that there was some history before the writing. And it proves, especially because some of these are, talking about a high Christology and the deity of Christ. So it shows like this is what the people were thinking and doing. And that leads to the fact that this was a faith that the people had, and the apostles, even though we do understand them to be written by inspiration, the apostles had people to hold them accountable. And let's see here. Okay, so that's about it for right now on this issue. As I said, it's weird because you gotta, you read the Bible for years and you just don't read the Bible that way. And so, somebody has to show me errors in the Bible before I can deal with them. I just do because natural readings show that this is something amazing from God. So we'll catch you later.